What saved America's daylight bombing campaign was not courage, it was not numbers, and it was not superior firepower. It was the correction of a deadly mistake. On the 14th of October, 1943, over Schweinfurt, the math finally became undeniable. Captain Don Blakeslee watched 316 B-17 seconds fly on without escort, because his P-47 seconds simply could not go any farther. That day was not a tactical failure. It was a systems failure. The Air Forces already knew what bombers needed to survive. Continuous escort, all the way to the target, and all the way home. The solution already existed. The aircraft had already been built. The data had already been recorded. And the system had rejected it. Not because it didn't work in war, but because it violated assumptions, pride, and procurement logic. What changed the air war over Europe began with an act that was officially illegal. A mechanic with no authority flew the wrong airplane, wrote the wrong memo, and exposed the flaw no doctrine wanted to admit. If you follow this story to the end, you will understand why the P-51 Mustang was never just a fighter, and why one ignored technical truth mattered more than every approved plan that came before it. What saved America's daylight bombing campaign was not courage, it was not numbers, and it was not superior firepower. It was the correction of a deadly mistake. To understand that mistake, you have to understand the math that governed the air war in 1943. On October 14th, 1943, American bombers climbed into the sky over England and headed east toward Schweinfurt, Germany. Their target was not a city or a rail yard, but ball-bearing factories, industrial nodes so critical that German war production could not function without them. 316 B-17 flying fortresses formed up into tight defensive boxes, each aircraft bristling with machine guns, each crew trained to believe that formation firepower would keep them alive. But firepower was never the problem. The problem was time. The bombers needed hours to reach Schweinfurt, drop their bombs, and make the long return flight to England. Their fighter escorts did not have hours. Captain Don Blakeslee, commanding American fighters that day, knew exactly how little margin existed. His P-47 Thunderbolts were powerful, rugged aircraft, but they were short-legged. Their fuel capacity limited how far they could go into Germany before turning back. As the formation pushed deeper into enemy airspace, Blakeslee watched the fuel gauges sink toward empty. He did not need new intelligence to know what would happen next. He had seen it before. When the fighters turned back, the bombers would continue alone. And once that happened, German interceptors would arrive in force. They always did. Over Schweinfurt, the Luftwaffe did not need innovation or surprise. They only needed patience. Fighters circled like predators, waiting for the moment the American escorts disappeared. Then they attacked methodically, tearing into the bomber boxes again and again. By the time the mission ended, 60 B-17 seconds had been destroyed. 600 American airmen were dead or captured. This was not an anomaly. It was the predictable outcome of a system that accepted an impossible equation. Bombers required continuous protection. Fighters could not provide it. Everyone involved understood this. Pilots knew it. Commanders knew it. Loss statistics confirmed it mission after mission. Yet the daylight bombing campaign continued, not because American leaders were indifferent to casualties, but because they believed they were constrained by reality. They believed no fighter existed that could solve the problem. The system had reached a conclusion, and that conclusion shaped every decision that followed. The logic was simple. Bombers had to fly. Fighters would escort them as far as possible. Losses were tragic, but unavoidable. That belief hardened into doctrine, but doctrine has a dangerous tendency. Once it solidifies, it stops asking questions. The most important question was never asked loudly enough. Not which fighter performs best in tests, but which fighter keeps bombers alive with fine. By October 1943, that distinction had become fatal, because somewhere outside the center of official planning, the answer already existed. An aircraft had been designed with exceptional range. Its aerodynamics were superb. Its handling impressed anyone who flew it. But it had been evaluated using criteria that did not reflect the true nature of the war being fought. It failed a test. And because it failed that test, it was dismissed. The system did not consider whether the test itself was wrong. It did not consider whether the aircraft could be changed. It accepted the verdict and moved on. Over Schweinfurt, that decision was paid for in blood. Captain Blakeslee would later transmit words that echoed through Air Force headquarters. The bombers needed a fighter that could go all the way to Berlin and back. What he did not know was that such a fighter was already real, not hidden, not secret, not theoretical. It had simply been rejected because it did not fit the system's assumptions. And until those assumptions were challenged, the math of death would continue to govern the sky. The disaster over Schweinfurt did not come from poor flying or bad intelligence. It came from a question that had been asked the wrong way and then never revisited. Inside the Army Air Forces, aircraft decisions were not made in the sky. They were made in evaluation rooms, on test ranges, and inside procurement offices where war was reduced to charts, thresholds, and checklists. Those systems were built to answer a specific kind of problem. Which aircraft climbs faster? Which turns tighter? Which carries heavier guns? Which performs best at a prescribed altitude? Each question made sense on its own. Together, they formed a framework that looked scientific, objective, and disciplined. But none of them asked the one question that mattered most in 1943. Which aircraft could escort bombers all the way to their targets and bring them home alive? That question was uncomfortable, because answering it required accepting trade-offs the system was not designed to accept. Escort fighters were judged in isolation, not in context. They were evaluated as if air combat happened in a vacuum, one fighter against another at a specific altitude for a brief window of time. But bomber escort was not a duel. It was an endurance problem. Bombers flew slow, straight, and predictable routes for hours. They could not disengage. They could not hide. They could not accelerate away from danger. Any escort fighter that abandoned them, even after doing everything right, failed the mission. Yet procurement logic did not frame it that way. Instead, fighters were graded by performance snapshots. A climb rate here, a speed figure there, a ceiling number measured during a short test flight. Within that framework, one aircraft stood out as a disappointment. It performed exceptionally well at low altitude. Its range exceeded expectations. Pilots praised its handling. But at the altitudes where doctrine said air combat occurred above 25,000 feet, it lost power. That single data point defined its fate. The conclusion was not that the aircraft was close to being right. The conclusion was that it was wrong. The evaluation reports were precise, careful, and misleading. They acknowledged the aircraft's strengths. Then they dismissed it as unsuitable for high-altitude escort and interception. Once that verdict was issued, it hardened into institutional truth. From that point forward, the aircraft was no longer a candidate for improvement. It was a problem already solved. The system moved on. This is how large organizations fail, not through ignorance, but through closure. Once a decision is made, every subsequent process reinforces it. Budgets are allocated. Factories are assigned. Training pipelines are built. Admitting the decision was flawed does not merely require changing an opinion. It requires undoing commitments. And undoing commitments implies responsibility. So the system does what systems often do. It defends its previous answers. Other fighters were already in service. The P-47 Thunderbolt was powerful, durable, and well-armed. The P-38 Lightning promised long-range and heavy firepower. Both were approved. Both were funded. Both were defended. Their shortcomings limited range in one case. Mechanical issues in the other were treated as acceptable constraints rather than fatal flaws. The possibility that a rejected aircraft could be the real solution was not seriously entertained, because that possibility threatened the logic that had guided procurement decisions up to that point. What made this failure particularly dangerous was that it felt rational. No one believed they were ignoring a better option. They believed they had already tested it. The aircraft had failed the test. Case closed. But the test itself had embedded assumptions that no longer matched the war. It assumed fighters only needed to perform well in short engagements. It assumed altitude performance mattered more than endurance. It assumed escort was a secondary task, not the core requirement. By 1943, those assumptions were killing people, but the system did not see it that way. Losses were attributed to enemy strength, to bad luck, to the inherent cost of war. The connection between evaluation criteria and bomber graves was never formally drawn, and so the question remained unasked. Not which aircraft can win a dogfight. If you ascend, the first is diff. But which aircraft makes the bomber campaign possible at all? With the nothing, until someone outside the procurement process reframed the problem, the system could only produce more of the same answers. And over Germany, those answers continued to fail. At altitude, air combat is not decided by bravery or tactics. It is decided by air itself. As aircraft climb, the atmosphere thins. Oxygen decreases. Engines that rely on air to burn fuel begin to starve. This was not a secret in 1943. Every engineer understood it. Every test pilot felt it. The difference between victory and failure at 25,000 feet was not wings or guns. It was breathing. The fighter that procurement had rejected was not aerodynamically flawed. In fact, its airframe was among the most efficient ever designed. Its wings reduced drag dramatically. Its fuselage was shaped by calculation rather than tradition. Its cooling system recovered energy instead of wasting it. Everything about the aircraft suggested speed, range, and efficiency. Everything except one component, the engine. The aircraft was powered by the Allison V1710, an American engine designed with reliability and simplicity in mind. At low and medium altitudes, it performed well. It delivered steady power, resisted damage, and was easy to maintain. But above 15,000 feet, its limitations became unavoidable. The Allison used a single-stage, single-speed supercharger. That system compressed incoming air only once before feeding it into the engine. At lower altitudes, this was sufficient. At higher altitudes, it was fatal. As air density dropped, the supercharger simply could not compensate. The engine produced less power. Speed fell. Climb rate collapsed. At 25,000 feet, the altitude where bomber formations flew and interceptors waited, the aircraft was no longer competitive. German fighters could dive, attack, and climb away without fear of pursuit. The aircraft that should have escorted bombers became a liability. Procurement officers saw this clearly in the test data. The conclusion seemed obvious. The aircraft could not fight where the war was being fought, and so it was rejected. But this conclusion rested on an assumption that went unchallenged, that the engine was inseparable from the aircraft. In reality, the problem was not that the airframe failed at altitude, it was that the airframe was paired with the wrong lungs. Across the channel, British engineers had been fighting the same altitude problem for years. Their solution was the Rolls-Royce Merlin. Unlike the Allison, the Merlin used a two-stage, two-speed supercharger. Air was compressed once, then compressed again, before entering the cylinders. The result was transformative. Where the Allison gasped for oxygen at altitude, the Merlin thrived. At 25,000 feet, it produced significantly more power than the Allison ever could. To a pilot, the difference was immediate. To an engineer, it was decisive. This was not a matter of marginal improvement. It was a fundamental change in operating environment. An aircraft that struggled above 15,000 feet could suddenly dominate above 25,000. The irony was brutal. The aircraft procurement had rejected was not underpowered by design. It had been underpowered by pairing. The airframe had been evaluated as if its engine were fixed forever. No one asked whether replacing that engine would change everything. That question existed outside the procurement framework, because procurement logic evaluated aircraft as finished products, not adaptable systems. Once an aircraft failed its official trials, it was labeled unsuitable. Modification was treated as inefficiency. Improvement was considered wasteful. Why invest resources into an aircraft already rejected, when approved fighters were already in production? This logic made sense in a stable environment, but the air war over Europe was anything but stable. The altitude of combat had risen, the escort requirement had expanded, the mission profile had changed, the evaluation criteria had not. The engine mismatch created a dangerous illusion. It made a superior airframe appear inadequate. It hid the aircraft's true potential behind a single variable, and because that variable was not questioned, the system misdiagnosed the entire problem. The aircraft was not wrong. The assumption was. What made this failure so persistent was that it felt technical rather than conceptual. Test charts showed reduced speed at altitude. Climb curves dropped sharply. Numbers appeared objective, but those numbers answered a narrow question. How does this aircraft perform with this engine at this altitude? Were cache. They did not answer the question that mattered. What happens if the aircraft is given the engine the mission requires? All. That question would not come from procurement committees or doctrine manuals. It would come from someone who understood engines intimately and was willing to look past official conclusions. Someone who did not see the aircraft as finished, but as unfinished. And once that realization surfaced, the logic that had governed the air war until Schweinfurt began to fracture. By the spring of 1943, the problem was no longer technical. It was institutional. The data existed. The airframe's potential was obvious to anyone who understood aerodynamics. The engine that could solve the altitude problem was already flying combat missions. Yet nothing changed. Because the barrier was not ignorance. It was authority. Inside the Allied war machine, decisions followed strict channels. Aircraft procurement was governed by committees, memoranda, and approved requirements that moved slowly and resisted reversal. Once a design was rejected, it was not merely set aside. It was labeled settled. Reopening that decision meant questioning the competence of the system itself, and systems do not welcome that. There were reasons, each logical on its own. The engine that could unlock the aircraft's potential was British. The aircraft itself was American. National pride mattered. So did industrial policy. American fighters were expected to use American engines. British engines were already in high demand for Spitfires, Lancasters, and Mosquitoes. Diverting them to an aircraft the Americans had already dismissed looked inefficient, even irresponsible. There were also sunk costs. Factories were tooling up to build approved fighters. Training pipelines were established. Supply chains were optimized around existing decisions. Changing course would not just require new engineering. It would require admitting that earlier choices had been wrong. In wartime, admitting error carried political risk. It slowed production. It created friction between allies. So the system defaulted to what it had already chosen. The P-47 Thunderbolt would escort bombers as far as it could. The P-38 Lightning would fill the gaps where possible. Losses would be absorbed. That was the plan. What made this inertia deadly was that it looked reasonable from inside the bureaucracy. Every memo had a justification. Every rejection had a paragraph explaining why resources were better spent elsewhere. No single decision looked monstrous. But together, they formed a pattern that protected pride rather than pilots. It took an outsider to disrupt that pattern. Ronald Harker was not a senior commander. He was not an aircraft designer with authority over American programs. He was a Rolls-Royce test pilot and engine specialist. His job was to evaluate engines, not airframes, not doctrine, and certainly not foreign procurement decisions. He had no mandate to interfere, but he had something the system lacked: a narrow, dangerous clarity. When Harker flew the American fighter that had been dismissed as inadequate, he did not see a failure. He saw a mismatch. The aircraft's handling was excellent. Its aerodynamics were clean. Its performance limits were not structural. They were respiratory. To an engine specialist, the conclusion was unavoidable. The aircraft did not need to be redesigned. It needed to breathe. Harker understood what that meant. He also understood that there was no formal mechanism to raise that conclusion. If he submitted it through official channels, it would be filtered, delayed, and likely dismissed as irrelevant. So he made a decision that violated protocol. He wrote a report recommending that the aircraft be fitted with the Merlin engine. He had no authority to do so. He was not assigned to evaluate American fighters. He was not authorized to suggest modifications to foreign military equipment. By the rules, what he did was improper. By wartime standards, it was insubordination. But the report was precise, technical, and devastating. It did not argue philosophy. It did not challenge doctrine. It simply stated that the airframe was superior and that its only limitation was the engine, and that replacing the engine would change everything. When the report reached senior British officials, its implications were immediately understood. They faced their own dilemma. Pursuing the recommendation meant confronting American procurement decisions. It meant diplomatic friction. It meant bypassing established processes. But it also meant the possibility of saving thousands of aircrew lives. Faced with that choice, protocol began to bend, quietly. Without public approval, without joint committees, without formal authorization, the decision was made to test the idea directly. A Mustang airframe was taken. The Allison engine was removed. A Merlin was installed. This was not a sanctioned project. It violated ownership agreements. It ignored procurement boundaries. It operated in the shadows of official policy. It was, in every sense, a forbidden experiment. The work was not simple. The Merlin was physically different from the Allison. Mounts had to be redesigned. Cooling systems reworked. Propellers replaced. Engineers worked knowing that if the project failed, there would be consequences. But the test flight did not fail. When the modified aircraft climbed, it did not struggle. When it reached 25,000 feet, it did not fade. It accelerated. The data that came back from those flights could not be ignored. Speed increased dramatically at altitude. Climb rates surpassed expectations. Range remained unchanged. The aircraft that had been rejected as unsuitable had become something else entirely. This was the moment when bureaucratic logic began to collapse, because the test did not merely suggest improvement. It invalidated the assumptions that had justified rejection in the first place. The problem had never been the aircraft. It had been the evaluation framework. Once that truth emerged, the system faced a choice it had delayed for years. Continue defending earlier decisions, or accept that the wrong rules had been protecting the wrong outcomes. Acceptance did not come gracefully. There were arguments. There were memos attempting to minimize the results. There were warnings about disruption and supply constraints. But the data was now attached to a flying aircraft, not a paper proposal. It was real. And in wartime, reality eventually overrules procedure. What began as an unauthorized test forced a reckoning. American leadership could no longer dismiss the aircraft as a theoretical fix. They had to confront it as a proven one. The rule that had once protected pride had failed to protect pilots. And once that failure was visible, it could no longer be defended. The system had been cracked open not by rebellion, not by ideology, but by a single technical truth, proven in the air. When the modified fighter proved itself in the air, the problem stopped being theoretical. For the first time, the argument was no longer about projections, charts, or competing memoranda. It was about a machine that had already flown, already been tested, and already shattered the assumptions that had governed the air war. The data coming back from the Merlin-powered aircraft forced a confrontation with reality. At altitudes where previous Escort fighters struggled to remain competitive, this aircraft accelerated. Where others lost power, it gained it. And crucially, it did so without sacrificing the one attribute the bomber campaign needed most: range. That single fact changed the conversation. Until then, Escort doctrine had been shaped by limitation. Fighters were expected to stay close to bomber formations, conserve fuel, and disengage as soon as gauges demanded it. Escort was defensive by necessity. The new fighter made that logic obsolete. It could climb with the bombers, cruise above them, weave back and forth across the formation, and still have fuel to fight. It could remain on station for the entire mission profile, not minutes, but hours. For the first time, Continuous escort was no longer a theoretical requirement. It was an operational reality. When the aircraft entered service in late 1943, skepticism remained. Pilots transitioning from larger, heavier fighters looked at it with doubt. It appeared smaller. It carried fewer guns. It did not project intimidation on the ground. But air combat does not reward appearances. On its first missions, the difference became immediately clear. The new fighter did not need to conserve energy the way earlier escorts had. It could climb aggressively, dive without fear of fuel starvation, and regain altitude without falling behind the bombers. German pilots noticed the change before official reports did. They were accustomed to American fighters making a single pass and then disengaging. They expected escorts to vanish long before targets were reached. This time, they did not. Engagements that once favored the defenders began to collapse. German fighters diving into bomber formations found escorts already above them. Attempts to disengage were met with pursuit rather than relief. The tactical balance shifted quickly. But the true transformation came not from individual dogfights, but from a change in command philosophy. General James Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force, recognized what the new escort made possible. Previously, fighter units were tethered to bombers. Their purpose was to shield, react, and absorb. Doolittle changed that mission entirely. His directive was simple and radical: destroy the German Air Force wherever it could be found. That meant fighters were no longer required to stay close to the bombers at all times. They could sweep ahead of the formations, intercepting German aircraft before attacks were organized. They could break off engagements without fear of being stranded. They could follow fleeing enemies instead of watching them escape. Most importantly, they could attack German airfields directly. This was a strategic shift, not a tactical one. The goal was no longer merely to survive missions. It was to eliminate the enemy's ability to contest the air at all. The new fighter's range made this possible. German airfields that had once been sanctuaries became traps. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Pilots were lost before they could even take off. Attrition accelerated. German units that had once relied on experience and local superiority found themselves facing an opponent that could choose when and where to fight. Loss ratios reflected this shift brutally. American escort units began achieving kill-to-loss ratios that had been unimaginable earlier in the war. German pilot losses mounted faster than replacements could be trained. Experience, once the Luftwaffe's greatest advantage, became a liability as veteran pilots were lost and replaced with increasingly inexperienced ones. The bomber campaign felt the effects immediately. Mission loss rates dropped. Formations arrived at targets with fewer disruptions. The massed attacks that had once devastated unescorted bombers became rare. This was not because German pilots had lost skill or courage. It was because the system supporting them was collapsing. The new fighter denied them initiative. German tactical directives from early 1944 reflect this desperation. Pilots were instructed to avoid extended combat with the new American escort if possible. They were told to attack quickly and disengage immediately. But disengagement was no longer guaranteed. The escorts had fuel, they had altitude, and they had freedom. By spring 1944, the consequences were undeniable. Bomber losses that had once threatened to end the daylight campaign fell sharply. Deep penetration raids that had been unthinkable months earlier became routine. Berlin itself was no longer out of reach. This change had cascading effects. With air superiority established, Allied planners could operate with confidence. Rail networks were attacked systematically. Industrial centers were hit repeatedly. German production suffered not because individual factories were destroyed, but because the entire system supporting them was disrupted. And when the time came for the most complex operation of the war, the skies were already decided. During the Normandy invasion, German fighter opposition was minimal. Allied aircraft dominated every altitude. The Luftwaffe still existed on paper. It still flew sorties. But strategically, it had been broken. The fighter that made this possible was not the most heavily armed. It was not the fastest in a straight line under perfect conditions. It was the most adaptable. It gave pilots something none of its predecessors could provide: choice. They could engage or disengage. They could escort or hunt. They could stay or leave. Their opponents had none of these options. This asymmetry mattered more than any individual performance statistic. The air war did not turn because one aircraft was marginally better. It turned because one aircraft allowed an entire doctrine to change. The system that had once optimized for isolated performance was forced to confront mission reality. And once that confrontation occurred, there was no going back. The patch worked. But what it patched was not just an aircraft. It patched a broken way of thinking. The fighter that had once been rejected now reshaped how the war was fought in the air. And the implications of that change went far beyond escort missions. They marked the beginning of the end for Germany's ability to defend its skies. By the summer of 1944, the outcome of the air war over Europe was no longer in doubt. German fighters still flew. They still intercepted. They still achieved occasional victories. But the shape of the conflict had changed in a way that could not be reversed. What ended the contest was not a single battle, nor a sudden collapse. It was the steady removal of choice. The American fighter that now dominated the sky did not win because it was perfect. It won because it could decide. In air combat, choice is everything. The ability to engage on favorable terms. The ability to disengage when conditions turn hostile. The ability to climb, to dive, to extend, to return. Earlier escorts had forced pilots into rigid behavior. They stayed close because they had to. They disengaged because fuel demanded it. They avoided pursuit because return was uncertain. The new fighter removed those constraints. For the first time, American pilots controlled the tempo of combat. They could attack when advantage existed. They could withdraw when it did not. They could follow enemies deep into hostile airspace and still return safely. Their opponents could do none of these things reliably. German fighters faced an opponent that was never trapped. If they climbed, they were followed. If they dove, they were chased. If they turned, the fight stayed with them. Even escape carried risk. This asymmetry was devastating. German pilots had trained for years to exploit the weaknesses of earlier American escorts. They knew when to strike and when to disengage. Those instincts no longer worked. The familiar patterns failed, and when patterns fail in combat, casualties follow. The Luftwaffe's greatest remaining advantage experience began to evaporate. Veteran pilots were lost faster than they could be replaced. New pilots entered combat with fewer hours, less training, and shrinking odds. The American system, by contrast, grew stronger with time. Pilots accumulated experience and survived long enough to apply it. Aircraft returned, damaged but repairable. Engines proved reliable. Losses, while still real, became manageable. This imbalance fed on itself. Each month, German capability declined. Each month, Allied confidence increased. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy, the contest for air superiority had already been decided. German fighters flew only a fraction of the sorties they once had. Airfields were under constant threat. Fuel shortages worsened the problem. The skies over the invasion beaches were effectively closed to meaningful German opposition. This outcome was often attributed to numbers. American industrial capacity was immense. Production rates were staggering. But numbers alone do not explain dominance. Without the right tool, numbers simply produce more losses. What mattered was that the system now possessed an aircraft that matched the mission reality. The fighter was not just protecting bombers, it was reshaping the environment in which the enemy was forced to operate. The German Air Force did not lose because it was cowardly or incompetent. It lost because it was placed in a position where every option carried unacceptable risk, and that position was created by a single change in capability. It is tempting to describe this outcome as inevitable, to say that American industry and resources would have prevailed regardless, but inevitability is a comforting myth. The daylight bombing campaign was close to collapse in 1943. Loss rates were unsustainable. Confidence was fragile. Without a fighter that could escort bombers to the deepest targets and remain effective throughout the mission, the strategy might have been abandoned or drastically curtailed. That did not happen, because the system corrected itself late, imperfectly, but decisively, and it did so by accepting a truth it had initially rejected: that the most important performance metric was not speed, not climb, not armament, it was optionality. The aircraft that won the air war was the one that gave pilots choices, choices the enemy could not counter. This lesson extends beyond aviation. The story of this fighter is often told as a tale of innovation, of daring engineering, of a brilliant design. But that framing misses the deeper point. The breakthrough did not occur because a genius invented something new. It occurred because someone recognized that existing tools had been evaluated through the wrong lens. The aircraft already existed. The engine already existed. The data already existed. What was missing was the willingness to challenge the framework that dismissed their combination. The system did not lack information. It lacked flexibility. It was built to optimize decisions, not to revisit them. Once a conclusion had been reached, every process reinforced it. Budgets followed, factories followed, doctrine followed. Reversing course meant confronting sunk costs and institutional pride. That confrontation did not come from the top. It came from someone close to the hardware, someone who did not see an aircraft as a finished product, but as a set of possibilities. The unauthorized test flight that triggered this transformation did not break the rules for its own sake. It exposed which rules no longer served reality. That distinction matters. Breaking rules is not inherently virtuous. Most rules exist to prevent chaos. But when rules protect decisions that no longer match the environment, they become liabilities. The system that rejected the aircraft was not malicious. It was rational, disciplined, and confident. It simply optimized for the wrong problem. Once that problem was corrected, the outcome followed rapidly. Production scaled. Training adapted. Doctrine evolved. Within a year, the aircraft that had been dismissed as inadequate became the backbone of Allied air superiority. By war's end, thousands had been built. Thousands of enemy aircraft had been destroyed, many on the ground, where they posed no threat at all. Loss rates remained lower than those of earlier fighters. Pilots trusted the machine to bring them home. The legacy of this transformation persisted long after the war. The aircraft served in new roles, in new conflicts, under new flags. Its design principles influenced generations of engineers, but its most important legacy was conceptual, not mechanical. It demonstrated that the decisive advantage in complex systems comes not from maximizing individual metrics, but from preserving freedom of action. In war, in engineering, and in institutions, the side that retains options forces the other into desperation. The air war over Europe ended not with a single climactic battle, but with one side realizing that it no longer had choices. Every sortie became riskier, every engagement more constrained. The sky belonged to the force that could decide, and that force owed its advantage not to mythology, but to a moment when the system allowed itself to be corrected. The fighter that achieved this was not a miracle. It was a reminder. That progress often comes from recombining what already exists. That expertise closest to the problem often sees solutions first, and that systems which cannot question their own assumptions eventually fail under the weight of reality. The P-51 Mustang did not win the air war because it was flawless. It won because it gave its pilots the one thing their enemies could not reclaim: the ability to choose.